Welcome to Learning Through Technology, a K-12 EdTech podcast proudly presented by STS Education. I'm Alex Inman, founder of Educational Collaborators.
And I'm Bob Cerruti, founder of the EduTech Group. We're here to bring educators together, helping them unlock the full potential of learning through technology.
Tune in every other week as we connect with education leaders and dive deep into topics that matter to you, delivering actionable ideas straight to your school. Welcome to the show.
All right, Alex, you're letting me lead off again here today. And I think maybe you're letting me do it because I'm the guy clamoring for a revolution or some disruption to the way education works these days. If you haven't got that out of me, I guess you really don't listen to me. But today, I think what Coach Hicks is doing is just phenomenal. Today, we're going to talk to Coach Hicks, who has got this radical idea of what if we take the 50% of underserved communities in technology or in Black, brown, female, and give them the opportunities, the foundation of technology to learn the technology and to grow into STEM careers. Our company at EduTech, we've been very fortunate to grow the last few years significantly. I think we're up to about 40 technicians and engineers now, but we always have positions open. And it seems like there are never enough candidates from those communities. And Coach Hicks here is the guy who's changing the way STEM is perceived, I think, by those communities.
Yeah. Well, and I want to dig into that because it's more than just sort of an access question. It really is about the kind of development of those communities so that they see themselves in these roles, or more people see themselves in those roles, so that we get more of those kinds of candidates and that they have a chance to sort of see that future for themselves if that is indeed what they're most interested in. So I'm looking forward to this. We've had him on our schedule for a while, so I've been waiting around for this interview to happen. So what do you say we get into it?
I say we should.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining another episode of Learning Through Technology, our K-12 podcast. We have a fun episode today. So we have our guest, Victor Coach Hicks, who is the founder and owner of Coding with Culture, dedicated to making computer science and STEM education inclusive and culturally relevant. We've been chatting a little bit before we started the episode, and I'm very, very excited to have you here, Coach. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Coach, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got here.
Actually, it's interesting. As you guys mentioned, I am the founder and director of Coding with Culture. It was a venture that came about after I guess at that point, it was like 15 or 16 years in education. Taught everything under the bus from high school to PE to, Title I reading interventionalist, and got an offer to come to Atlanta and for a computer science position. They were just kind of starting it out. That was 3 years before COVID. Once COVID hit, we had some parents that were like, hey, our kids seem to love being in your class. Would you mind doing a summer camp, spring break camp? And the rest is history. We're still building the plane. I'll find it. Unfortunately, we're working with quite a few more schools, our individual students and teachers. So it's been a very interesting journey getting here.
I think every teacher, when offered, would you like to get a stipend to do this in the summer? Or yes, please, yes.
And tell people, when they ask about the kind of the magic formula of how this happened, and it literally, no joke, was just continuing in what we were doing. I think none of us we didn't have any predecessor or any experience, teaching online like that. So it's kind of like, okay, let me pull the next hat trick out of like what worked or what didn't. So, but it's been a good journey. Interesting, but good.
So we had just 2 minutes of talking. Now I've already got 3 different thoughts swirling in my head. The first is, I love that we have Coach Hicks. Like, this is the first guest that's been Coach. And I think that's so apropos for somebody who's working with students to learn, right? It's Coach Hicks. That really works. The other thing that crossed my mind is that we all 3 of us have in common is you didn't set out to found a company or to do this. You were doing what you enjoyed. You were helping students and schools, and it found itself. And I think Alex and I have that in common as well with the educational collaborators and EduTech. So we're all of a common feeling here and all having worked in schools and then founded these things. So we have the foresight or the benefit of seeing your whole resume before we meet with you. But it's quite impressive. I'd like you to spend a little more time on how you go from classroom to coding with culture. That's a big leap.
It is. It was a scary one. I tell you, it definitely was one. I was kind of like, I got midway through the process and I'm like, do I really want to do this?
I think every entrepreneur feels that question.
Listen, I tell you, it is not for the weak. As a lot of kids or young people I mentor through their various entrepreneurial travels, I tell them just that, it's not a journey for the weak. But I think you brought up a good point. One thing that made it doable, I guess, for lack of a better word, is that it was a labor of love. It was something that teaching was something I was passionate about. Once I really saw how computer science was able to and would be able to continue to level the game for students of all backgrounds, I think that's when it became a true passion. And so, again, we started the year before COVID. I went to a new school, was teaching K through 8. Everything was great until that March. And then the world stopped. And so that first spring break was actually the time, because again, park districts, a lot of the virtual world hadn't quite developed yet. So we had parents that were like, hey, our kids are home. We don't know what to do. Everybody, I think at that point, was still working from home because we were only a month or so in. But we got a group of parents who signed their kids up. But we literally just did 2 sessions. I did a STEM session in the morning where we had the parents order. We did marshmallow with the toothpicks and the highest things. And then we did computer science afterward. And one of the things I realized was that the engagement was there. I think that was one of the hardest parts as an educator. So I'm like, okay, I'm seeing students who traditionally struggle in person classroom because now a lot of the things that, whether it be distracted them or just really didn't allow them to fully engage in the learning, were removed. So it was interesting to see how that it really kind of helped some students, I guess, from at least in some perspectives. From there, we went on that summer. We were offered the opportunity to do a summer camp. I actually had a friend who did like the first inclusive CS, one of the first like online, when they transitioned to teacher PD online large scale, presented there. And then the following year, I was going to go back and they were like, well, the position is going to change. And one thing about it is that I always wanted to make sure teaching was at the core of what I did. So decided to take the leap of faith and partner with my first school again, beginner's luck.
So wait a second, actually, let me make sure that I understood the first part. So during COVID, when you were doing like the morning programs and that kind of stuff, was that still through your district?
So no, I was doing that on the side. So we did it. I got approval from our principal. So yeah, I guess it'd be like a year and a half, almost 2, where I was doing both. So I was still teaching computer science and then doing tutorials after teaching hours.
Got it. So there was an overlap. So you were kind of building the business through sort of extracurricular activities, sort of side business activities, while still being a full-time teacher. And did that happen kind of the whole way through the pandemic and you decided to make the leap? That fear and energy that comes from making the leap, I'm always fascinated with. So tell me, where did you make the leap from full-time educator to doing this as your new full-time gig?
It was actually the year after the pandemic when we came back, where schools were starting to, so I guess that would have been 21, 22. And so again, I was teaching at a charter network and they were changing some things around and moving some. And so I got offered a position at a different campus. And one of the things at that point was really 10 toes down with the whole computer science. I really wanted to stay in that realm, make sure I was teaching that. So things didn't work out. They had a different kind of path they wanted to go. And I was like, well, I love what you guys are doing. But at that point, really it started to ground that passion in computer science. And so literally resigned. And I mean, again, at that point, I did have clientele. I was a part because it was starting to be a heavy lift doing both. But I think that was kind of the universe saying, okay, now or never, So, I think if there were one thing I had to pinpoint is that I was starting to look for actively jobs outside of education. And being a teacher or an educator at any cost is who I am to my core. So at that point, it was just more of like, okay, let's figure out how we can continue to do what you love to do, but in a way that's respectful to how I wanted to do it. So I think it was the nudge that I needed because I'm also a creature of habit. But I probably would not be sitting here I'd still be doing these fabulous camps and driving myself crazy. And I'm happy for that because I think it's been a path. And once I did take that leap, I was able to impact and really kind of drive or build Coding with Culture to be what I wanted it to be.
Good for you. That's awesome.
Coach, let me compliment you because you said, gave you that nudge. If it were me, I would have needed a locomotive to push me the way you just needed a nudge, huh? You're a better man than I.
Well, okay, now I won't say who gave the nudge now because it could have been that same little model. It just had to tap me real quick. But no, it definitely, and because again, when we do, and when I say that, people that impact or work in this field from our IT people, I think we go into these, but most of us like that sense of security. Of course, I know that expands outside of educators, but so much of our lives is scheduled. You come, you teach history from here to here. You have sophomores from 8 a.m. And, so our lives become the regimen. When I was looking at it, I said, okay, you're happy teaching, you're not happy working for somebody else. And again, because knowing what being raised by educators, there were certain things that I was like, yeah, I can't continue to show up and seeing that things are being harmful to kids and not be able to do something about that. So it was a nudge. I think I'll meet you halfway, Bob. It was like the locomotive, but maybe nudge just be too gentle of a verb.
So in reading your background, one of the things that caught my eye, one of the very first things was the statement K to HBCU is your goal. That's what you want to do. And boy, is that ambitious and not something that we've heard often, honestly, or at least I've not heard often. And I think it's worth talking about. So I'd like to hear, it sounds ambitious as heck. And I've only known you now for 15 minutes and it sounds like this will be no problem for him. So let's hear about how that happens.
I think for me, it's really looking at, again, we talk about, I think, why computer science was so important, because very quickly I realized that this is something that kids needed to know. It definitely was going to be the world that we are preparing kids for. But also when we think about kids who, one of the things I think is the biggest pros for introducing kids to computer science is that now that's the great equalizer. So if college education was not something that a family could reasonably afford, there are pretty marketable pathways now. So what I was figuring is, okay, well, how do we address both sides of this digital divide? So we have this low percentage of people of color or women that are going into computer science or engineering. Number one is going to be the rigor. We have to get them excited, which I think we did a great job doing in, the later 2000s. I guess about 2015, we first started to see that push for the younger kids to go into computer science. But I think the educator in me said, okay, but we have to support them in this. So how do we get kids to continue to push when they are the only one in a room, or if they are the one of few, or if there's not someone that may be willing to come in and take you under their wing? Where do you build that strength? And I remembered my HBCU experience, and that was so fundamental to the man I grew up to be, the educator that I was. And I'm like, how do we combine these things? So if we get these Black and brown children or these women or girls interested in computer science, where are these schools? How can we get them to see these schools as that same level of support? So you're going to get the rigor, you're going to get the knowledge that you'll need, but you also will have professors and mentors that will help build up all that resolve that you have to have, really, to compete in any field. But I think definitely one where we see that disparity. So what we hope is that through our outreach and our professional development, getting other teachers to kind of start teaching with some of those concepts in mind, that we can build that pathway. So if we ignite the flame in elementary school, kids see a realistic pathway outside of Hour of Code or outside of the couple of cool projects that they do in those situations. So it's ambitious, but I think for me, one thing with education is I don't like to play with or lie. I shouldn't say lie, maybe a bit strong word, but I like to give kids the total picture. So if Coach Hicks is teaching you something or giving you this skill, we're not here to waste time. And here's the picture from kindergarten through of how to make this happen, from the excitement through the training all the way to that when it's time to go into that career or to entrepreneurship.
Okay. This will be odd for anybody who's ever listened to us before. Hi, Mom, Dad, Marissa. That I always make that joke. There's only people who are listening, but it turns out Sophia tells us that 16,000 people viewed our last YouTube episode. So, hey, welcome.
Well, it'll be 16,000 likes. As soon as my mother gets the links, trust me, she will. That'll be the next.
Nice. 16,001.
Yes.
It's a deal. But I don't normally ask all these questions, but I'm so interested in this because, again, you keep saying these words that get my attention. Essentially, it is less heard of for advisors, coaches like you to tell students that it's going to be rough. This is a difficult marketplace to be in. You've got to have the talent and the work ethic. And the word that you used that caught my attention was rigor. The quality of work will count too.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that is important when we do this is that giving kids the realistic portrait of what's to come. When difficult doesn't necessarily mean impossible or shouldn't mean impossible. But I think for me, what I was seeing is that, again, we were kind of building this plan as we were flying it. So I was coming into the age of all the let's gamify coding and the kids can move the Minecraft characters or the little bee. And it was great. But what I was starting to see is that when my kids were transitioning into middle school, and they were working with actual coding, I shouldn't say actual, but the text coding languages and syntax and all the things that kind of filters kids the separates the males from the boys, they were struggling. And so what I started to see was, okay, we want to, if we look at pedagogy in general, K through the early years when you kind of build this excitement, you build the foundation, the exposure. But at some point, you got to be ready to go, because I can teach as many Black and brown kids as I want and get as many of them as I want in computer science. But if AP computer science or intro to HTML is going to be the deal breaker, then we're still dealing with the numbers that are a little discouraging. So I think as a teacher that can give them that dose of reality, but still with a piece of love that the world isn't necessarily worried about, giving them, I think it's only the morally right thing to do, because I would hate for them to get excited to, again, build the rigor, go through these courses, and then get out in the world and not be ready. So then we really haven't continued that impact. So yeah, I think dose of reality is good, because we do want kids to want to do this, but I also don't want my kids to ever get really heavy, really in the thick of things, and then say, oh, wait a minute, I didn't think it was going to be this.
Can we dig into that just a little bit? Because I'm fascinated by this, and I think it's really important stuff. Because, like, in your background, we read a little bit more about some of the culturally responsive teaching that you're talking about. And you said earlier that a lot of these kids may be the only woman, Black student, brown student in the room. And it's unfortunately very true, and something that the industry needs more help with. And so it's exciting that you're providing that support and help. And so when you talk about that dose of reality and prepare students, not only to have the rigor and the skills necessary, the technical skills necessary, but how are you preparing them for the non-skill related challenges, the professional challenges that come from being the only woman, Black, brown developer, coder, technician in the room? How do you prepare them for that? And what does that culturally responsive education look like?
I think, again, it goes back to the point, Alex, of the pathway. And I think where Coach Hicks is in realizing that, as although that is the mission of Coding with Culture, part of that is realizing I'm only a part of that journey. So I think being in that K-8 space, because I've learned to stay in my lane, because I think it's helpful to recognize what you do well and really worry about being impactful there. And all that to say, so I feel like my job, or people that are in like community with me, we're building the fire. We're lighting the fire. We're putting things with the kids or these underrepresented populations, or I even say in some cases, historically excluded populations. They see themselves in the work. So that's where a lot of the basic part of the culturally responsive pedagogy comes in. So things when you look at, one of the reasons we adopted the HBCUs, because although it helps kids learn about a pathway, these are also really cool cultural places for kids to build apps about, or to research in order to be able to build a video game. And I think that's where you really build the I belong here mind frame. And I think looking at the HBCU piece of it, and I tell people, I think one of the things that was special about my HBCU experience wasn't that I could only function in places that were predominantly African American, but that they built up such a sense of confidence in me that if I walked into a room of three-headed monsters, I knew how to communicate my strengths. I knew how to use those things. So I feel like it's important to really get, or to, as again, talking about each part of the journey being as important as the last, as they get older and as they start to look at the reality of, hey, okay, I may leave this safe space and go into a company where I may be the only woman or the only Black or brown person, but I really want to make sure those students are finding, again, just really building that sense of confidence. So yes, HBCUs were great from the cultural piece, but the big part of it is that we want students to get the resolve to be able to show up and win no matter what situation. So I think it's making sure the kids get each piece of the development for each part of the pathway that they're supposed to get.
Nice. Thank you.
I think I've caught Alex off guard because I've got yet another question. He's like, oh my God, Bob's talking.
I like to keep things interesting. I take it as an honor. I'm like, hey.
It is. This is awesome. Enough to where I'm not even letting Alex know with like some sort of high sign. Hey, I got another question. So you've laid out what your vision is, K to HBCU. If we look, and you've been at this with Coding with Culture for about 3 years now by my math. When you look at this in 5 or 10 years, what success look like for you in Coding with Culture? What will have happened that makes you think this is what I wanted to do?
So for me, I think one of the biggest things we're looking at with Coding with Culture is how we replicate this to other places. We really want to, again, a big part of it right now, I'm just being completely transparent. rides with me. So I'm the one presenting at the schools, also doing a lot of the behind the scenes, well, all the behind the scenes work. So I think for me, I would like to see Coding with Culture make enough of an impact to really start to challenge or to disrupt or to change some of the ways that we're preparing these historically excluded populations for the real world. I think one of the biggest disconnects in education is a lot of the practices that we do. We're preparing children for the Industrial Revolution to go and kind of sit on a classroom and just kind of these repetitive skills or, just kind of regurgitating information was to prepare people to work in an industrial world. But I think undoubtedly we're in the information age. So I would hope that we impact enough teachers, enough students, whether that be through our individual coding or us going into schools or partnering with youth groups to get some conversations started, to see how beneficial that really being intentional about including kids' culture and using these innovative methods, real world problem solving to allow these kids to shine. So if I can say that there's somebody else out here that's helping me do that, I don't know if I can say change the whole world, but I think if we can get into a couple of districts, a couple of schools where we have educators that are really starting to just build really and cultivate and build best practice, because I think slowly but surely that's how we'll start to see some change come about. So if we can play a part in that, I'd say that'd be a pretty good check mark for success.
You've got a lot of the right tools. So I was looking into some of your curriculum, and I know design thinking is sort of central to that. And I think I was first introduced to design thinking from Google when we were doing kind of the 10X projects. And they were looking for how do we go out and change the world? And that's kind of precisely what you were seeking to do through your organization. So I'm kind of a design thinking hack wannabe. And Sophia, our executive producer, even has more of that skills. Share with us a little bit about how design thinking plays into your curriculum and maybe how it has played into your journey as a business owner or vice versa. I'm not sure what's the chicken and what's the egg in this one, but I know design thinking is part of that. Tell us a little bit about the role that it's played.
It's interesting that you bring it because I think that's one of the things as I look back after kind of starting this journey, it has been the most interesting. We talk a lot of times cliche about teachers being lifelong learners, but I think for me, it was just that. Because again, I think in the beginning, I was very thankful for a lot of the scripted coding curriculums because I was learning to teach computer science. But at the same time, I was realizing as I kind of got my feet wet and got a little more experience, it really wasn't a lot of connection to how kids can apply this. So if I love coding, what can I go do with this? And so I said, okay, is it kind of researching? I got a little bit of training and learned a lot about project-based learning. And I'm like, okay, I see this. How do we compare these skill sets? And so again, from that, a big part of PBL usually is the design thinking. So I really did a lot of reading, did a lot of research, kind of immersed myself in that and kind of tried it. And the amount of engagement was, I think, grew tenfold. So again, I think it was central to our success in that pandemic as Coding with Culture grew. And as I went through, again, as I was kind of, like I said, building the thing, writing the curriculum to literally teach the classes that parents were signing kids up to take, I'm like, well, I'm doing design thinking myself, right? I'm kind of going through. And so for me, it really kind of helped shape that project. So I was actually going through and could speak to what iteration looked like. And, as I found myself really being able to empathize also with my kids, because it's like, this sucks. Well, you try something that's 6,000. I don't care how, read all the things. Oh, don't worry about it. You'll be okay. No, you're irritated. And in order to prepare students for that, it's like, yeah, I tell them like coding gets, because when you, like I said, and I think that was going back to that rigor we were talking about. Like, yes, when you sat somewhere for 2 hours and you realize it was a semicolon that has kept you stuck for all these hours, you are going to be pissed off. You are. So coaching, able to be in that with my kids, it was invaluable because again, I don't like to waste kids' time. And I think this generation, we talk about these kids and it's like, yes, but these kids are here. I think whether we're Gen Alpha, like they are true to who they are. And part of that is that they, how can I say, embrace or accept things that they can make very concrete, logical connections to. I'm learning this to be able to do this. And so for me, I think that design thinking was important because it allowed kids to see that, number one, there's so many different entry points into into technology, period, because we need the creatives. We need the people that are the analytical people that can come in and comb through that code after the person who might be the one to kind of say, okay, let me just get this out, this way. So I think for me, it made the design thinking was a learning lesson for me. And it made my process a lot easier to be able to put a name on it. But also, I think it was one of those things that makes our learning experiences so genuine because my kids, I'm like, hey, yeah, I get it. So it's been a huge part. I think that's been probably one of the most beneficial parts of that journey is being able to kind of go through that process and learning that process with my kids.
Coach Hicks, if you've ever wandered a conference with me and Alex, you'll see Alex is kissing babies, shaking hands like he's running for election or something. You're not running for anything next month, are you, Alex? Are you? And by the time you hear this, you'll know whether Alex has won.
Right. I would watch the results like, wait a minute.
He approves this message. So if you've gone around with Alex, he gets asked questions as if he knows all and sees all. It's just ridiculous. But one question I do see him get a lot, and I'm very curious based on your background and your goals, and you're honestly different than many of the other guests we've had, but what role do you see AI playing in your organization now or in the future? And is it different for the kids that you're working with, the students that you're working with that are historically excluded, as you said?
Well, it's interesting. And I think for me, it has definitely been something that, again, rolling with the punches or kind of growing in mindset as things come along. But I don't think I look at AI from two ways, right? Everything always has the possibility of being used for good or for wrong, right? I mean, kids have found ways. I think one of the biggest things that we said as an educator is kids are going to cheat, they're going to cheat. And AI has so many positive possibilities that we can't minimize it to it's just going to be a tool to cheat or just go. Because in that case, you wouldn't have kids bring notebooks or you wouldn't allow kids. I mean, I've seen kids try it on. So, I mean, I think first is that I want us to kind of get out of this idea that we're just looking at it from this one very narrow perspective. And part of that, and my biggest motivation behind that, Bob, is that it's an equity piece. So if we talk about numbers of African Americans or numbers of Latino or women that are engineering, and they're in these single digits, which is very scary, it's irresponsible for us to count them out of what's clearly, and it's like as much, the sky is falling as I hear from a lot of my fellow educators is like, AI is here to stay. And it's every day it's coming in more and more. So we're looking at Black students and brown students and indigenous students, and they're only at 1 or 2 or 3%. If all we're pushing the narrative in their educational experience is, oh, this is a terrible thing and stay away from it because I can't give you the same multiple choice quiz I've been given for the last 10 years, then I think that's when we have to start talking about what being a disruptor in education is about. Because, but again, I think when we talk about some of the ways that AI is coming into law enforcement and to, again, like it or not, it's here. And so my thing is that we have to get diverse people at the table that are able to approach it from the building level so that these voices and these opinions and these life experiences are shared. Because standing in the corner talking about how terrible it is not changing the fact that it's here. And it's going to be a very, very big part of our futures, but definitely the futures of our children. So I think we have to kind of go in, but I also realize with educators, again, as much as we tell kids about opening their minds, we're creatures of habit. So new things for educators are scary sometimes, but I think we're at a very interesting point in our world where it's like, you got to kind of put up or shut up. If you're not willing to grow and innovate, you can't just put those words on a bulletin board and say, this is STEM. We want innovation. But every time a new technology comes, you want to closet the kids off. Right? And literally a lot of it is just due to adult fear, right? I mean, I think about like in high school, man, my teachers hated the internet. Like, oh, I will never, you cannot cite a website. You cannot. And I'm like, imagine if we kept that. And like I said, but think about also how much further some of these communities could have been if we hadn't done that in the 90s or the 80s, as it was starting to really creep into the world of technology and education. So I think, like I said, for me, it's going to be a reckoning night, a reckoning day, so to speak. And again, it's okay. But if this 20th century, 19th century version of education best suited you, we can't keep doing disservices to these kids to keep the adults comfortable.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad, I like what you said about getting them, like your students, even more involved in this, because it's more than just sort of like the access question when you think about the internet. The reality is AI leverages information from society to do basically its math and responses. So the biases that exist in society today are amplified and clarified through AI. So the more your students get involved in AI, it's not just a access thing, it's actually a risk avoidance thing. Because when you think about the role that AI is going to play in policing, in government, in policy creation, those biases become institutionalized the more we leverage AI. Not that they're not institutionalized now, but what I'm saying is that it becomes even more entrenched rather than hopefully what we'd like to see is less entrenched, right?
Well, I just go to that crossroad.
Yeah, it really is at a crossroads. So, how do you kind of thinking about your comments earlier about sort of amplifying your mission so that more places are doing it and all that kind of stuff? Here's your first step on that. So, what advice would you give educators to bring culturally relevant curriculum to their districts so that your mission gets further empowered? Here's your chance.
Hire me.
Hire coach.
We would love to. Actually, no, shameless plug. We absolutely would love one vertical to the districts. But I think really the biggest part, Alex, Bob, is really just the mindset. When I tell districts, the first thing is that you have to be very genuine in your ask. And I think that for me is one of the most important parts, because the beautiful part about post-pandemic is we did have this push for more people paying attention to DEI. I think the catch-22 with that was a lot of it was not, and I think the easiest word to say is the intent. But I don't think it was necessarily had to be malice or ill intent, but if you're not coming from a genuine place, and that genuine place can be very scary, because part of that starts out with, okay, we have to really take an inward look. What are some of these biases? What are some of these, like you said, these institutionalized policies that, again, it may not be that I dislike someone or had, any type of, but you have to kind of do some digging. And so I think for me is to tell, really look at the mindset. And then second, be realistic. We're not going to go from a district that has never talked about diversity because we never had to now we are the world and everybody's holding hands and singing Kumbaya. That can be a path that we move towards, but being realistic in where your district or where your school is and their journey is important. And I think looking at it and then third, and I promise like the biggest or last overarching step is looking at communities in your school. Because I think one of the bigger parts we talk about, and I think it's a very legitimate question, is I have teachers that say, well, coach, I don't necessarily teach Black or brown kids. I say, well, let's look at community. We teach middle school kids, you're dealing with adolescents. That's a community. You have kids that are athletes. That's a community. And so I think the way that when I tell people culturally responsive is that culture far beyond exceeds race. I mean, there were certain things definitely in my life that impacted me culturally as a Black man, but even growing up in the city versus the suburbs and going to Catholic school versus public school. So really looking at embracing those cultures that make up your school community. And then for that part, it really just is a matter of putting the best tools in place to get where you need to go. So I think this first thing is really just doing some self-searching more as a community, school being first. But I think sometimes with the district it can be kind of challenging, but you have to be willing to do that work. And I think once you start there, because one of the harder parts is that culturally responsive doesn't mean, okay, we got something up, we're doing something for Black History Month, we're doing something for, it's like, okay, but how does that impact? Because kids are also very good at knowing when it's just like a show. It's okay, it's February, so we got to check this box. Versus we're really making a change in our school to make sure that our curriculum reflects our children. And again, the part that's hard, our policies, our discipline areas, how are teachers interacting with children? And so all of that, I think, is really making sure you do that soul searching first, and then find your communities and how you can highlight them. And then the work kind of does itself, because then you can plug in the resources, the professional developments. Again, hire us. But it definitely works. Like I said, but I think that part, because again, I can only come in and do so much to grow that if you're not in a place where Coding with Cultures work, or any of my wonderful colleagues that do it from so many different other areas or vantage points. But we can't come in and create miracles because we're not the superintendent. So that's a big part too.
Coach, Alex and I fully endorse your plan for schools to hire you.
I mean,
I can say that unequivocally.
I'm trying to get out of Chicago. So I'm just getting told, look, I need all those states from.
Right. It's going to be winter and you're in Chicago.
Right. After Thanksgiving, my calendar is completely open.
So over the last 40 minutes, we have heard how you have obviously made an impact on your students and even those who aren't your students as you bring this message in your program. So now we just want to know who led you down this path. Who was your favorite teacher or had a big impact on you?
Okay, I want to give two because I think there was a part of that going back to the pathway. So I was raised in a family of educators. So definitely my mom and my aunts, I'll use them as a collective one because I think being these educators was so much of who they were. And so having that dedication, so many of those things were, I just was able to absorb from seeing them do the work that they did. This was before the days of all the technology or grants or, like I said, people weren't having these discussions about equity, but they still managed to make that happen. And so for me, I think that is one of the things that sometimes now look up and I'm like, well, I haven't really done anything major. This is just me doing what I saw my mom and my aunts do. My mother's philosophy always was, you close your door and you teach your kids. Whatever's going on, you are responsible for those people in that classroom. And so you do what you know how to do and what you have to do as an educator. So I think that was the foundation. Specifically, though, my seventh grade social studies teacher, Mr. Moore, he was one of my first, well, it was my first male teacher outside of PE. But I think the thing that stood out was he was so passionate about his subject because he was that. I was telling you, I went to this public school, middle school in South Side of Chicago, and every seventh grader, boy, girl, and different. I mean, our class was, I think there were 140 of us, all joined the choir because Mr. Moore was in charge of it. And so we didn't care what he just did, because if anyone that hears me sing is like, you get what? But I think too that because we saw his passion in what he taught. I think, especially within social studies, why it stood out even more, because I feel like that's one of those classes where it's like, yeah, your teacher being passionate about it makes or breaks history, because history can be terrible if somebody's teaching off a script and it's just, but I mean, to this day, I mean, even after teaching 20 years, I still don't know how he managed to get across some of those points, but because he did and because he made it a point to connect and he built those relationships and built that community. I think that his impact, I mean, to me, sometimes I'll say things and I'm like, man, like, how am I channeling Mr. Moore from 100 years ago? But I think this just shows, what, and again, how cliche sometimes it can be, but it really, to me, I think it speaks to what the impact of an educator can be. And so those days where it gets hard, like this, oh, it sucks, I'm broke, what am I going to do? It's helpful to have that memory and say, okay, you're here because this person kept going and continue to not only just teach, but teach with excellence. So it's a good reminder that I think, to whom is given, much is required. So, but I would say those are my biggest influences between my family and then definitely Mr. Moore from the educator perspective.
That's awesome. Well, Coach, thanks so much for giving us your time today. This was fun. I think Bob and I could probably talk for 2 more hours.
I don't say this is a good conversation. I enjoyed this one.
This was great. Thanks so much for joining us today. It was really great.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Well, Bob, that was fun. I mean, both from an entrepreneurial perspective and certainly from an educational perspective. What struck you most about the episode?
Well, fun it was. I certainly enjoyed talking to Coach Hicks. I enjoyed that he goes by Coach. I think that seemed apropos. But I found it different, not what we usually talk about, or not how we usually talk about technology. We talked about technology, but we didn't talk about it in the same way. I guess I shouldn't say what really struck me is you saw in there, I talked a lot, which is unlike me. But one of the things that I made a note of when he was talking was he referenced the cost of college and how there are all of these opportunities in technology that don't require a college degree. And they're good paying opportunities and they are career building. And when you're talking about the communities that he specializes in, we'll say, how important is that? Because we know college isn't getting more affordable. And there's this idea that everybody who wants to be successful has to go to college. But I think that's true. Our CTO here is the smartest engineer you're going to come across at EduTech, and he doesn't have a college degree, any of it. And I think exactly what Coach Hicks was saying is you find those bright people and give them the opportunities.
Yeah. So I think what struck me actually is an interesting tangent from that, because when he was talking about his HBCU experience, he was talking about not only the skills that he got, but also the confidence in the space. And I appreciated and respected it's tough enough to learn the skills and be competent and confident in an industry that changes all the time. Like being a lifelong learner doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go to college, but it's hard work. to be that lifelong learner in a constantly changing space. Add on to that the challenges of being the only woman, brown kid, black kid in the workspace who's trying to figure out what that workspace is. And I respected the comment about the confidence that he got from the HBCU to empower and enable those more historically disenfranchised communities to have the confidence to succeed in that space on top of all of those other challenges that the industry brings. I just thought it was a fun conversation with a guy who's got a great mission, and I really want to see him succeed.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Bob, thanks again for another good episode. And in this case, letting me sort of ride on your coattails for all those excellent questions that you asked.
Well, I don't know about riding my coattails. I suspected we'll find you spoke plenty in this episode. Learning Through Technology, a K-12 EdTech podcast, is brought to you by STS Education, a Pacific OneSource company. To learn more about how educators can leverage technology to drive successful educational outcomes, check us out at www.stsed.com. Connect with us by searching for Learning Through Technology in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss an episode. On behalf of the team at STS Education, thanks for joining us.